He was the son of a grocery store owner. He grew up in a cramped apartment in the South Bronx, one of the toughest and most overlooked corners of New York City, where nobody had extra money and nobody was thinking about fashion. You would think a poor Jewish kid from a working-class immigrant family with no connections to the industry and no obvious path forward would never build one of the most recognized clothing brands in the history of the world. But Calvin Klein would launch the designer jeans revolution, put his name on the waistbands of millions of people across the globe, redefine what American minimalism looked like, and sell a lifestyle so powerful that even controversy made him richer. He did it with $10,000 from a childhood friend, a small showroom on the wrong floor of a Manhattan hotel, and an instinct for what people wanted before they knew they wanted it. So how did a boy with nothing from the Bronx become the designer who changed what America wore and how it wore it? To find out, we have to go back to 1942. If you enjoy stories about the dreamers and builders who shaped the world we live in, hit like, subscribe, and share this video right now before we dive in. Calvin Richard Klein was born on November 19, 1942, in the Mott Haven neighborhood of the South Bronx, New York. His father, Leo Klein, ran a small grocery store on the streets of the neighborhood, and his mother, Flora Stern Klein, managed the household with the discipline of someone who knew exactly how far every dollar had to stretch. They were Ashkenazi Jewish immigrants building a life in one of New York's most demanding boroughs, Shan, where the apartment was small, the neighborhood was rough, and the idea of becoming a famous designer was not something that came up in conversation. Calvin grew up alongside two siblings in a household where survival was the priority and luxury was not part of the vocabulary. From the time he was young, something separated Calvin from the other kids on his block. While his friends were drawn to sports and street games, Calvin was obsessed with clothes and drawing. He filled the margins of his school books with sketches of dresses and suits. He watched the way women moved through the neighborhood and noticed the details of how they dressed. He studied fabric and color and the way a well-made garment could transform the person wearing it. His grandmother recognized what was happening in her grandson and chose to encourage it rather than redirect it. She bought him sketchbooks. She sat beside him while he drew. She told him his talent was real and worth pursuing. In a neighborhood where most boys were being pointed toward trade school or factory work, his grandmother's quiet belief gave Calvin something he would carry for the rest of his life: the conviction that where he was from did not determine where he could go. By the time Calvin reached his teenage years, his direction was already decided. He applied to and was accepted at the High School of Art and Design in Manhattan, one of the city's selective public schools for students with demonstrable artistic talent. Every morning, Calvin took the subway out of the Bronx and crossed into a Manhattan that felt like a different world entirely. He was a kid from Mott Haven walking into a school full of students who took art and design as seriously as he did, and he matched every one of them. He was focused, talented, and completely certain about what he intended to do with his life. If Calvin's story is already grabbing you, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video. It helps us keep telling stories like this one. After graduating from the High School of Art and Design, Calvin enrolled at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York City, known as FIT, one of the most respected fashion schools in the country. This was not a school for people who were still figuring out their direction. It was a school for people who intended to work in the industry professionally, and it gave Calvin the technical foundation to match the natural instincts he had been developing since childhood. He learned to cut patterns, construct garments, understand the properties of different fabrics, and think about clothing as both an artistic practice and a commercial enterprise. He graduated in 1963 with skills that could take his sketches off the page and into the real world. After graduation, Calvin did what every young designer in New York had to do at the time. He took the work that was available. He apprenticed for several New York coat and suit manufacturers, learning the industry from the inside rather than from a classroom. He watched how established designers operated, how collections were assembled and presented, how buyers worked, and how the business of fashion actually functioned beneath the glamorous surface. Those years in the background of the industry taught him two things that would define everything he built. The first was that the American fashion market was dominated by European designers whose products were priced in a way that excluded the vast majority of American consumers. The second was that there was an enormous and underserved audience of Americans who wanted genuine style without the European pretension, quality without the import price tag, and a clean and modern aesthetic that reflected the way American life actually looked and felt. Calvin saw the gap clearly, and he began to figure out how he was going to fill it. The story of how Calvin Klein became Calvin Klein is impossible to tell without telling the story of Barry Schwartz first. Barry was Calvin's childhood friend from the Bronx, a kid who had grown up on the same streets, attended the same schools, and understood exactly where they both came from and what it had taken to get where they were. While Calvin had gone into fashion, Barry had gone into business, eventually taking over his family's supermarket operation in Harlem. In 1968, Calvin was 25 years old and working in the industry, designing coats and suits for manufacturers who controlled the label and kept the profits. He had the talent. He had the training. What he did not have was the capital to build something of his own. He went to Barry Schwartz and laid out his vision for a line of coats and suits built around clean lines, simple silhouettes, and a refined American sensibility that did not owe anything to the European tradition. Barry gave him $10,000. That was the entire investment. $10,000 from a childhood friend who believed in him, and Calvin Klein Limited was born. Calvin rented a small showroom on the 6th floor of the York Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. He hung his coats and suits on racks in a room that was barely large enough to walk through comfortably, and he waited for the right person to find him. What happened next became one of the most retold stories in American fashion history. A buyer from Bonwit Teller, one of the most prestigious department stores in New York at the time, stepped off the elevator on the wrong floor. He was looking for something else entirely when he walked past Calvin's showroom and stopped. The coats in the window caught his attention in a way that nothing else had that day. He walked in, looked at the collection, and placed an order for $50,000 on the spot. In a single afternoon, Calvin Klein went from a man with a vision and borrowed money to a designer with a real order from one of New York's finest stores. Word moved through the buying community with remarkable speed. Within weeks, other buyers were making their way to the York Hotel to see the young designer whose coats had stopped a Bonwit Teller buyer in his tracks. The fashion press began to take notice. The New York Times wrote about him. The industry started paying attention to a 25-year-old from the South Bronx who seemed to understand something about modern American style that the establishment had not yet articulated. By the early 1970s, Calvin Klein had established himself as a genuine force in American ready-to-wear fashion. His collections were clean, confident, and unmistakably American in their sensibility. He won his first Coty Award in 1973, the fashion industry's highest honor, and then won it again in 1974 and 1975, becoming the first designer in history to win 3 consecutive Coty Awards. The industry had validated him. But it was a single decision in 1976 that would take Calvin Klein from respected designer to cultural force. That year, Calvin launched his first line of jeans. This was not an obvious move at the time. Jeans were workwear. Jeans were what you wore when you were not trying to project anything. The idea of a luxury designer putting his name on a pair of denim pants was considered either visionary or foolish, depending on who was making the judgment. Calvin's position was straightforward. He believed that jeans were the most democratic garment in America, worn across every class, age group, and background, and that if you cut them right, gave them the perfect fit, and charged the right price, you could sell them to everyone who wanted to feel attractive in what they wore every day. He was correct. Calvin Klein jeans were cut closer to the body than anything else available on the market. They were designed to fit in a way that made the person wearing them feel confident and desirable. They were priced significantly above standard denim, but they delivered on exactly what Calvin promised. Then came 1980 and the advertisement that stopped the country cold. Calvin worked with photographer Richard Avedon and cast 15-year-old Brooke Shields, one of the most recognizable young faces in America at the time. for a series of television commercials for Calvin Klein jeans. The campaign's central line, suggesting that nothing came between Shields and her Calvins, detonated a national controversy the moment it aired. Television networks refused to broadcast the commercials. Newspapers called them irresponsible. Religious organizations condemned them publicly. And every single American who had not yet heard of Calvin Klein jeans heard about them within 48 hours of the story breaking. The banned campaign generated more press coverage and public conversation than any paid advertising buy could have purchased. Sales accelerated beyond anything the company had projected. In the first year following the Brooke Shields campaign, Calvin Klein moved over $200 million worth of jeans. The designer jeans revolution was not coming, and it had already arrived, and Calvin Klein had started it. The jeans' success unlocked every door in the fashion world, and Calvin walked through every one of them with a speed and ambition that reflected his understanding of the moment he was living in. He expanded the brand across swimwear, handbags, shoes, and eyewear. He moved aggressively into fragrance with a lineup of perfumes and colognes that carried the same clean, sensual identity that defined his clothing. In 1985, he launched Obsession, a fragrance that became one of the best-selling perfumes in the world. The Obsession campaign, shot in high-contrast black and white with deliberately provocative imagery, reinforced everything Calvin had been building since the York Hotel. This was not fashion for people who needed to be told what was acceptable. No, this was fashion for people who were confident, modern, and unafraid. In 1988, he followed with Eternity, a fragrance built around a completely different emotional register, one that spoke to romantic commitment rather than desire. In 1991 came Escape, and then in 1994, Calvin made the most forward-thinking creative decision of his entire career. He launched CK1, a fragrance marketed explicitly as unisex, designed to be worn by anyone regardless of gender. This was genuinely radical in 1994. The perfume industry had built its entire commercial structure around clearly gendered products, and Calvin was proposing to tear that structure apart and replace it with something that reflected how younger Americans were actually thinking about identity and self-expression. CK1 became one of the best-selling fragrances in history, and its launch positioned Calvin Klein as a brand that was ahead of the cultural conversation by years rather than months. Meanwhile, in 1992, Calvin had already made another move that would cement his brand in American popular culture in a way that no fashion show or magazine feature could match. He cast Mark Wahlberg, at the time known as the rapper Marky Mark, alongside supermodel Kate Moss to front his underwear campaign. The photographs, shot by Herb Ritts, were bold, physical, and completely unlike anything the men's underwear category had ever seen. The waistband of a pair of Calvin Klein boxer briefs became one of the most recognized logos on earth almost overnight, and the underwear business grew into one of the most commercially significant divisions the company would ever operate. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, Calvin was also embedded in the world that New York City generated after midnight. He was a regular presence at Studio 54, the legendary nightclub that functioned as the unofficial headquarters of the city's creative community, where designers, musicians, artists, and actors shared a space that operated by completely different rules than the daylight world outside. Calvin thrived in that environment. He belonged to the scene that defined the era, but the same world that fueled his creativity was also a world of serious excess, and Calvin was not immune to what that excess could do to a person. By the mid-1980s, Calvin Klein was one of the most famous designers in the world, but the personal cost of building everything he had built had been real and significant. His marriage to Jane Center, whom he had married in 1964 and with whom he had a daughter named Marcy, had ended in divorce in 1974. The demands of constructing a company from nothing, of working at a pace that left very little room for anything else, had placed enormous strain on every relationship in his life. Calvin was candid in later years about the struggles he navigated during the height of his fame, including his use of alcohol and prescription drugs during a period when the culture around him normalized behaviors that were quietly doing serious damage. In 1988, he checked himself into the Hazelden Treatment Center in Minnesota. When he came out, he had a clarity and a focus that would shape the next chapter of his career and his life in ways that the years of excess never could. There were also professional crises that tested the company's resilience. It is a 1995 advertising campaign featuring very young models in poses that drew immediate and intense public criticism, set off a federal investigation, and generated backlash that damaged the brand's standing at a moment when it could least afford the distraction. Calvin pulled the campaign immediately, addressed the criticism directly, and moved forward. He had survived harder things than a public controversy. He had survived the near collapse of the company in the early days. He had survived the personal turmoil of the 1980s. He had learned, over 30 years in the industry, that the only thing that kept a brand alive through a crisis was the integrity of the product and the clarity of the vision behind it. He protected both. By the late 1990s, the Calvin Klein Company was a global enterprise generating billions of dollars annually across dozens of product categories. The brand name appeared on clothing, fragrance, underwear, handbags, shoes, eyewear, and home goods, with licensing agreements that had stretched the reach of the label across manufacturing operations around the world. But the same licensing model that had made the brand ubiquitous had also begun to create a challenge that Calvin understood better than anyone else in the building. When your name appears on everything, your name stops meaning anything extraordinary. The brand had grown so large and spread so wide that the premium positioning that had made Calvin Klein desirable in the first place was under pressure from every direction. Calvin was in his late 50s. Since he had spent more than 30 years building his name into one of the most recognized brands on earth, guiding it through near collapse and public controversy, reinventing it multiple times across different product categories, and taking it further than anyone from Mott Haven had any realistic expectation of going. He had done what he set out to do, and he had done it entirely on his own terms. In December 2002, Calvin Klein Limited was sold to Phillips Van Heusen Corporation for approximately $430 million. Calvin Klein was 60 years old. He had started with $10,000 from a childhood friend, and he walked away from the sale with a fortune, a reputation that had survived everything the industry had thrown at him, and a legacy that was already written into the history of American fashion. He retired from the industry after the sale and did not look back. He moved between his homes in New York, Southampton, and Miami, collecting art, supporting charitable causes, and living a life that bore no resemblance to anything the South Bronx of 1942 would have suggested was available to a boy born into his circumstances. Today, Calvin Klein as a brand continues under the ownership of PVH Corp., operating in over 110 countries with thousands of retail locations and a product range that spans clothing, fragrance, underwear, and accessories across every market in the world. The minimalist aesthetic that Calvin built his entire brand around, the clean lines, the neutral palettes, the emphasis on fit and simplicity over decoration and noise, these became the defining visual language of American fashion for a generation and influenced every designer who came after him. CK1 is still in production more than 30 years after its launch and still sells in volumes that most fragrance brands never achieve in their entire existence. The underwear campaign that made a waistband into a cultural icon is still referenced in advertising classrooms and marketing textbooks as one of the most effective brand moments in the history of the industry. Calvin Klein's personal net worth at the time of his retirement was estimated at over $600 million, built entirely from the decision to bet 10,000 borrowed dollars on his own talent and a tiny showroom on the wrong floor of a Manhattan hotel. But the number is not the point. What Calvin Klein proved was something far more important than the size of the fortune he accumulated. He proved that where you begin has no bearing on where you are capable of going. He was a kid from the South Bronx who knew how to sketch a coat and had a friend willing to bet on him when no one else would. He turned that into an empire by understanding, what American consumers wanted before they knew they wanted it, by making jeans into a luxury product, by making minimalism into desire, and by building a brand identity so strong that even its controversies made it more famous rather than less. He never had the European heritage that the fashion establishment considered essential. He never had the family connections that opened doors for other designers. He had clarity of vision, on the discipline to protect that vision even when the pressure to compromise was enormous, and the willingness to make decisions that looked reckless from the outside because he understood from the inside what he was building. Calvin Klein did not flinch when the networks banned his commercials. He did not flinch when personal struggles threatened to consume everything he had created. He did not flinch when the brand he had spent 3 decades building needed to be handed over to someone else. He built something that carries his name to every corner of the world, something that started with a childhood friend's $10,000 and a buyer who got off on the wrong floor. That is how a poor Bronx boy created Calvin Klein. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. We tell the stories of the dreamers, the builders, and the people who refused to accept the world as it was handed to them. We will see you in the next one.